I spent 40 years of my life building steel bridges across this country, ensuring every single foundation was completely unbreakable. But I never realized the foundation of my own family was entirely rotten. When the heavy steel door of my wall safe swung open, my late wife's solid jade necklace was gone. My own daughter looked me dead in the eye and smiled, admitting she had pawned the only piece of her mother I had left just to fund a luxury vacation. But when I tracked down that downtown pawn shop to buy it back, the owner's voice shook over the phone. He told me they had found a microscopic hidden latch inside the jade. What was inside that hollowed-out stone did not just break my heart. It proved my wife's sudden death 6 months ago was no accident. And it handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy my daughter's perfect life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood does not give anyone the right to exploit you. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 6 months to the day since a massive heart attack took my Sarah away from me. The house in Oak Park, Illinois was suffocatingly quiet. I walked into my study, the heavy oak floorboards creaking under my feet, a familiar sound that used to bring me comfort, but now only amplified the profound emptiness of the house. Outside, the rain lashed against the large glass windows, blurring the streetlights into glowing streaks of amber and white. I stood in front of the heavy steel wall safe hidden behind an old framed architectural map of Chicago. My fingers moved automatically, a routine etched into my muscle memory. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The heavy internal steel bolts clicked open with a solid metallic thud. I reached inside to pull out the small, worn red velvet box. It was a ritual I had performed every single month since the day we buried her. I did not want to wear it. I just wanted to hold the cool, solid weight of her favorite necklace. It was a custom piece I had commissioned for our 20th wedding anniversary, a deep green jade pendant set in a vintage gold chain. I still remember the way the gold caught the dim lighting of the downtown jazz club the night I gave it to her. But when my calloused fingers flicked the delicate golden clasp of the velvet box open, my breath hitched sharply in my throat. The box was completely empty. The dark velvet lining was bare. The heavy jade pendant, the intricate gold chain, the physical weight of 30 years of cherished memories, they were entirely gone. My mind, trained for 4 decades as a structural engineer to assess stress points and load-bearing failures, instantly went to work. I did the math in my head. There were no signs of forced entry. The keypad and the dial had not been tampered with. The steel frame of the safe was perfectly intact. There was absolutely no break-in. Furthermore, only 2 people on this entire earth knew the combination to that specific safe. Myself and my 32-year-old daughter, Brittany. I had given her the code just 2 weeks prior. She had claimed she desperately needed to retrieve some of Sarah's old birth records and family documents for her upcoming wedding preparations. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in the pit of my stomach, spreading a sickening chill through my veins. I refused to believe it at first. A daughter would not steal her dead mother's most prized possession. She just would not. I tried to convince myself that maybe she had taken it out to look at it. Maybe she had moved it to her own room for safekeeping. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that did not involve the ugliest kind of betrayal. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called her. She was already in the house downstairs in the living room, likely browsing through expensive wedding magazines or complaining about floral arrangements to her fiancé Tyler. "Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level, "come up to the study, right now." Less than a minute later, the heavy wooden door of the study swung open. Brittany stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe. She was wearing a designer silk blouse I had paid for, holding a cup of artisanal iced coffee I had financed, looking utterly inconvenienced by my existence. The sweet, cloying scent of her expensive perfume drifted into the room, masking the familiar smell of old paper and leather that usually filled my workspace. "What is it, Dad?" she sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Tyler and I are trying to finalize the seating chart for the reception." The caterers are breathing down my neck for the final deposit, and I really do not have time to sit around and chat. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed directly at the empty red velvet box resting on my mahogany desk. "Where is your mother's jade necklace, Brittany?" I fully expected a lie. I expected her to feign ignorance, to gasp in fake shock, to pretend we had been robbed by an intruder. I braced myself for a theatrical performance. What I got instead was a brutal, careless shrug. She did not flinch. The color did not drain from her face. Her breathing did not hitch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced coffee, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the plastic cup. "Oh, that," she said, waving her free hand in the air, as if she were swatting away a mildly annoying fly. "I sold it." The words hung in the air, echoing off the walls of the quiet study. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the absolute lack of emotion, the sheer barrenness in her tone. "You sold it." I repeated the words, tasting like dry ash in my mouth. "You took your mother's custom necklace from my private safe without asking me, and you sold it." "Do not be so dramatic, Dad," she groaned, stepping fully into the room and crossing her arms defensively. "It was just sitting there gathering dust. You never even look at it. I took it down to a pawn shop in downtown Chicago yesterday afternoon. They gave me $4,000 for it in cash. It was actually a really good deal considering how old-fashioned and tacky the setting was. $4,000. She traded the last physical piece of the woman who brought her into this world, the woman who loved her unconditionally, for a few stacks of quick cash. I felt a violent tremor start in my hands. I clenched them into fists at my sides to stop the shaking. "Why?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "Why would you do something so vile?" Brittany scoffed, letting out a sharp, condescending laugh, acting as if I was the one being completely unreasonable. "Because I needed the money, obviously. Tyler and I are completely stressed out with this wedding. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to coordinate 200 high society guests? My mental health is in the gutter. We desperately need a break. We decided to book a luxury vacation to Cabo for next week, just the two of us, to decompress before the final wedding rush. The flights and the resort required an immediate cash deposit, and our credit cards were maxed." I felt the blood rushing rapidly to my ears, a roaring sound drowning out the patter of the rain outside. A mental health vacation. A luxury trip to Cabo. She had desecrated her mother's memory for margaritas on a white sand beach. "You stole from me," I said, stepping closer to her, my towering frame casting a long shadow across the floor. "You stole from your own mother." Brittany's face hardened, her deep-seated sense of entitlement flaring up instantly like a lit match. "I did not steal anything," she snapped, her voice rising in a shrill pitch. "I am her only daughter. Half of everything in this house technically belongs to me anyway. Mom is dead, Dad. She is gone. She doesn't need a cold, stupid green rock locked in a dark metal box. What good is a necklace doing for a corpse? I am alive. I am getting married. I needed the money. Mom would have wanted me to have a stress-free wedding." The sheer audacity of her statement hit me like a physical blow to my chest. She was actually invoking Sarah's name to justify her own parasitic greed. My Sarah, who had worked double shifts at the hospital when Brittany was a child just to afford her expensive piano lessons. Sarah, who had defended Brittany every single time she made a reckless, selfish mistake. To Brittany, Sarah's precious memory was nothing more than a convenient bank account waiting to be emptied. I looked at the woman standing in front of me. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders through the park, the child I had protected fiercely for 3 decades. I realized in that suffocating moment that I did not know her at all. The girl I loved was a total fiction. The woman standing before me was a calculating stranger, wearing my daughter's face completely devoid of empathy, respect, or love. She had sold the necklace without a fraction of a second of guilt. And worse, she expected me to simply accept it, to bow my head, and prioritize her luxury vacation over my grieving, shattered heart. Before I could utter another single word to my daughter, the heavy mahogany door of my study swung open. Tyler stepped casually into the room. The immediate overpowering stench of his incredibly expensive cologne flooded the confined space entirely, erasing the comforting familiar scent of old leather-bound books and drafting paper that usually brought me a deep sense of peace. Tyler was 35 years old. He perpetually wore perfectly tailored Italian suits, his dark hair slicked back with an unnatural, calculated precision, his teeth blindingly white and flawlessly straight. He constantly presented himself to the entire world as a high-level financial mogul, a brilliant man who effortlessly moved millions of dollars before breakfast. Yet standing right there in my personal study with his hands resting lazily in his pockets, he just looked exactly like a cornered predator. He walked slowly over to Brittany and placed a highly protective, possessive hand firmly on her shoulder. He did not bother to look at me with even a single ounce of genuine respect or understanding. Instead, his lips curled upward into a slow, incredibly patronizing smirk. It was the exact kind of belittling look you give to a confused, helpless child who simply does not understand how the real adult world operates. "Is there a serious problem here, Richard?" Tyler asked. His voice was remarkably smooth, carrying that entirely fake, polished tone he frequently used whenever he was trying to close a difficult business deal. "We could clearly hear you getting completely worked up all the way from the kitchen downstairs. You know perfectly well that Brittany cannot handle this kind of severe emotional stress right now. Her blood pressure is already shooting through the roof because of the catering disaster." I kept my eyes locked onto his. "This does not concern you, Tyler. My daughter just admitted to stealing my late wife's jade necklace from my private safe and selling it to a pawn shop." Tyler let out a soft chuckle. He actually laughed. He shook his head, looking down at the hardwood floor before meeting my gaze again. "Stealing is a strong word, Richard," Tyler said, dripping with condescension. "Brittany is your only heir. Technically, everything in this house is hers anyway. You are acting like a clueless old fossil over a piece of cold metal. It was just a necklace. An outdated piece of jewelry sitting in the dark doing nothing for anyone. We desperately needed the immediate liquid capital to finalize our luxury reservations for Cabo. You should honestly be happy she found a highly practical use for it, instead of just letting it rot forever. A clueless old fossil over a piece of cold metal." Those words echoed loudly in my study. I looked at this 35-year-old man standing in the home I had paid off in full, wearing clothes I had subsidized. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I spent decades waking up before dawn, standing on freezing scaffolding, suspended hundreds of feet above the Chicago River. I built steel bridges that connected cities. I calculated complex load-bearing stress points to ensure thousands of people could travel safely every single day. My hands, scarred and weathered by brutal physical labor, had built a rock-solid foundation for my family. I willingly sacrificed my own physical health, my personal free time, and my daily comfort so that Brittany would never have to know what a life of crushing financial hardship truly felt like. I gave her absolutely everything a father could possibly provide, and now I was being mocked in my own sanctuary by a fast-talking kid who generated nothing of real value. Tyler produced nothing. He built nothing. He just moved imaginary numbers on screens and called himself a success. Yet he had the audacity to stand in my home and call my wife's memory a piece of cold metal. He thought I was weak because I was grieving. He thought I was a broken old man who would simply fold under pressure and accept their disrespect to keep the peace. He was severely miscalculating the structural integrity of the man standing in front of him. I took a deep, steadying breath forcefully, suppressing the highly volatile rage that violently demanded I throw him out of my house immediately. I needed to act strategically. "I want the receipt," I said. My voice was eerily calm, stripped of human emotion. It was the exact tone I used when a contractor tried to cut critical corners. It did not invite negotiation. Brittany blinked rapidly, stepping out from under Tyler's arm. "What?" "The pawn shop receipt," I repeated, extending my hand toward her. "You sold it downtown. They are required by law to provide a detailed transaction receipt, and hold the item before reselling it. Give me the receipt, Brittany. I am going to drive down there right now and buy your mother's necklace back. Brittany looked flustered. The arrogant demeanor she held minutes ago began to fracture. She glanced nervously at Tyler, her eyes silently pleading for guidance. She reached slowly toward the designer purse slung over her shoulder, fumbling with the golden clasp. "Dad, I do not know if I still have it," she stammered, losing her shrill confidence. "I think I threw it away, or maybe it is buried in my bag. It really does not matter anymore. The money is already spent on the non-refundable deposit. You cannot just go down there and easily undo it. Open the purse and hand me the paper," I commanded, taking a deliberate step forward. I was not asking. I was not negotiating. I was an immovable object standing directly in their path, refusing to yield a single inch. She unzipped the main compartment, her hands shaking slightly as she began to rifle through makeup compacts and loose papers. I could clearly see the edge of a yellow carbon copy receipt poking out from her designer wallet. She saw it too. She reached for it, but before her fingers could grasp the thin paper, Tyler moved. Tyler lunged forward and violently snatched the heavy purse right out of Brittany's hands. He yanked it forcefully against his chest, shielding it away from my reach. His jaw was clenched tight, and the smug smile had completely vanished, replaced instantly by an aggressive, highly defensive glare. "This is enough," Tyler snapped, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are acting completely hysterical over absolutely nothing. We are not playing this ridiculous game with you right now, Richard. You are not going to ruin our trip with your obsessive guilt. Our flight leaves in 3 hours. We have to beat the traffic to the airport, and I refuse to let your toxic negativity make us miss our boarding time." He grabbed Brittany tightly by the wrist, pulling her toward the hallway. "We are leaving," he announced over his shoulder. "We will talk about this when we get back. Grow up." They quickly turned their backs on me and angrily marched down the long wooden stairs. I did not attempt to chase them. I just stood perfectly still, silently listening, until the heavy front door finally slammed shut and the house settled. At least that is what I fully expected to happen. But the front door did not slam shut. Instead, I heard their footsteps halt. A tense whisper echoed upward. A few seconds later, Brittany stormed back into the study, but her arrogant demeanor had vanished. Her face was flushed, and thick, dramatic tears were streaming down her cheeks, smudging her expensive makeup. She threw herself onto the small leather sofa in the corner of the room and buried her face in her hands, letting out loud theatrical sobs that instantly filled the quiet space. "You are so incredibly unfair, Dad." Brittany wept, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "You have been doing this to me for 6 entire months. Ever since Mom passed away, you have turned this beautiful house into a suffocating mausoleum. You walk around with this miserable cloud over your head, and you expect everyone else to stop living. I am trying to plan the most important day of my entire life, and you are making me feel like an absolute monster for simply wanting to be happy." I stood frozen behind my desk, watching her perform. It was a classic manipulation tactic, an attempt to shift the guilt off her shoulders and place it directly onto mine. She was gaslighting me in real time, trying to convince me that my natural grief over losing my wife of 40 years was somehow a toxic burden that justified her stealing from my wall safe. "I have been drowning in anxiety," she continued, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes that held no genuine remorse. "Mom is gone, and I have to walk down the aisle without her. I am barely holding it together, Dad." Tyler saw how depressed I was getting, and he suggested we take a few days to decompress. I just needed to escape this heavy, depressing atmosphere. I needed to breathe. And yes, I took the necklace, but it was just a temporary solution to a temporary problem. Tyler stepped back into the room, handing Brittany a tissue. He wrapped an arm around her shaking shoulders and finally looked at me, adopting a calm and intensely reasonable tone. "Listen, Richard, I understand why you are upset," Tyler said smoothly, projecting the polished confidence of a corporate negotiator. "From the outside looking in, this seems like a drastic measure. But I assure you it was purely a logical, temporary sacrifice to protect Brittany's mental health. The timing is just incredibly unfortunate right now. My investment firm is finalizing a massive multi-million-dollar merger with a tech startup. Because of the scale, the board mandated a strict Q3 asset freeze. All of my accounts are locked in escrow until the closing paperwork clears on Monday morning. He adjusted his tie, maintaining eye contact. We are temporarily cash poor for exactly 5 days. The Cabo trip was a last-minute necessity for Brittany, and the resort demanded a wire transfer today. I told her to use the necklace as a simple bridge loan. I fully intended to go back to that pawn shop on Monday afternoon, the second my liquid capital is unfrozen, and buy it back for you. We were not selling it forever, Richard. We leveraged a stagnant asset to generate immediate cash flow. It is basic economics. He spoke with such conviction that a weaker man might have believed him. It was a plausible lie wrapped neatly in financial jargon, designed to confuse and pacify a grieving widower. But I was not a confused old man. I was a structural engineer. For my entire career, my daily survival depended on identifying microscopic flaws in massive systems. I spent decades analyzing the integrity of steel beams, understanding that a single tiny stress fracture could bring down a colossal bridge. As Tyler spoke, my analytical mind began tearing his elaborate story apart, testing the load-bearing columns of his convenient narrative. The structural flaws were glaring. A highly successful financial executive managing a multi-million-dollar merger would never find himself in a position where he could not access $4,000 in emergency cash. Wealthy men have expansive credit lines, offshore accounts, and access to diverse capital. They do not send their crying fiancés to a downtown pawn shop to hawk a dead woman's jewelry for pocket change. The entire foundation of his excuse was structurally unsound. Yet I realized something crucial in that exact moment. If I challenged his lie right now, they would only become more defensive. Tyler would spin more webs of deceit, and Brittany would escalate her sobbing to manipulate my emotions further. They would lock down, and I would learn absolutely nothing. If I wanted to uncover the real reason they needed that cash, I needed them to leave the house. I needed them to go on their fake vacation so I could operate in total secrecy. I forced my shoulders to drop. I softened the harsh lines of my face, letting out a heavy sigh designed to mimic the exhaustion of a defeated father. I lowered my gaze, playing the exact role they expected me to play. I am sorry, I said, my voice quiet and seemingly broken. You are right. I have been consumed by grief. I miss your mother terribly, and seeing that box empty triggered a horrible reaction. I should not have yelled. Brittany instantly stopped crying. The dramatic tension evaporated from her body in a split second. It is okay, Dad. She sniffled, offering a fragile, forgiving smile. I know you are hurting. We just want you to be happy for us. I lied smoothly, forcing myself to look Tyler in the eye without betraying the fury boiling in my veins. I appreciate you explaining the situation with your assets, Tyler. I know the business world can be demanding. Just please promise me you will get the necklace back on Monday. You have my absolute word on it, Richard, Tyler replied, visibly relaxing. He checked his gold wristwatch, a triumphant gleam flashing in his eyes. We really need to get to the airport now. We will call you when we land. Have a good trip, I said gently. Take care of yourselves. They turned and walked down the stairs, their footsteps hurried. I stood perfectly still in the study, listening as the front door opened and finally shut with a solid thud. The house fell completely silent. I walked to the large window and peered through the rain-streaked glass. I watched Tyler jog through the downpour toward his black Mercedes parked in my driveway. He opened the passenger door for Brittany before sprinting around to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the car backed out into the street, quickly disappearing down the wet road. They believed they had won. They thought they had manipulated a grieving old fool with fake tears and a fabricated story about corporate asset freezes. But as I watched their taillights fade, my engineering mind was shifting into high gear. The grief that paralyzed me for 6 months vanished, replaced by a calculating focus. They were hiding a massive secret, and I was going to tear their entire life apart to find it. The drive back from the hardware store was a dizzying blur of gray asphalt and steady windshield wipers. The revelation at the coffee shop played on a continuous loop in my mind. Tyler, the supposed financial prodigy, had just suffered the ultimate public humiliation. I had watched the barista hand his sleek black credit card back with an apologetic shake of her head. It was declined over a $15 order. I saw Tyler's face contort into a mask of sudden panic before he dug into his pockets to pay with crumpled cash. A legitimate corporate executive does not get his primary card declined over a couple of lattes. The entire narrative they had spun in my study was structurally unsound. I turned the heavy steering wheel, my tires splashing through deep puddles as I pulled into my driveway. Parked perfectly in the center of the driveway, blocking the path to my garage, was Tyler's shiny black Mercedes. Before they supposedly took a rideshare to the airport, Tyler tossed me the spare key, flashing that arrogant smirk and claiming he was leaving the vehicle at my house to avoid airport parking fees. At the time, it seemed like a typical inconvenience. Now, staring at the expensive German vehicle, it looked like a heavy prop in an elaborate stage play. I parked my truck on the street, zipped up my canvas jacket, and stepped into the freezing Illinois air. I walked slowly up the driveway, my boots crunching against the wet gravel. As I passed the sleek vehicle, my eyes naturally drifted toward the side of the house where I kept the municipal trash cans. They were pulled out slightly from their usual spot. The heavy plastic lid of the main recycling bin was propped open, completely overflowing with garbage. I stopped walking. My analytical mind, searching for inconsistencies, immediately locked onto this new anomaly. I am a creature of strict habit. I always ensure the trash is properly bagged and the lids secured shut to keep out raccoons. This was absolutely not my mess. I remembered watching Tyler make a hurried trip to the side of the house right before their ride arrived, carrying an armful of clutter from his car. Through the unforgiving lens of suspicion, it looked exactly like a man frantically purging critical evidence. A powerful gut feeling washed over my body. It was the exact same instinct that warned me when a massive steel beam was carrying too much stress, the quiet internal alarm signaling an imminent catastrophic failure. I did not want to dig through the garbage. I was a proud 70-year-old man, a respected engineer who had spent 40 years building a pristine reputation. But the burning need for the truth completely eclipsed any lingering pride. I walked deliberately over to the overflowing bin and pulled the heavy plastic lid back. The top layer was filled with what you would expect from a 35-year-old man who lived out of his car. I found crushed fast food wrappers, empty energy drink cans, and discarded coffee cups. But beneath that superficial layer, shoved forcefully down into the dark corner of the bin, was a thick brown paper grocery bag. It was tightly rolled at the top, deliberately sealed to conceal whatever was hiding inside. My weathered hands reached down into the damp darkness and pulled the heavy bag out. I carried the brown bag into the dimly lit garage, placing it carefully onto my old wooden workbench. The familiar smell of sawdust and motor oil grounded me before I proceeded to violate my daughter's privacy. I unrolled the top of the bag and tipped it over, spilling the hidden contents across the scarred surface. It was a massive pile of torn papers, unopened mail, and violently crumpled documents. This was a deliberate destruction of sensitive financial records. I pulled up the small metal stool and sat down, turning on the harsh fluorescent overhead light. I began to sort through the pile with methodical precision. I smoothed out ripped bank statements showing checking accounts with severe negative balances. I found multiple credit card bills highlighted with red ink, demanding immediate minimum payments that had been ignored for consecutive months. Every document painted a horrifying picture of absolute financial ruin. Tyler was drowning in inescapable debt. But it was the bright pink slip of paper crumpled tightly into a small ball near the bottom of the pile that completely stopped my heart. I picked up the crumpled ball and carefully flattened it out against the workbench. The paper was slightly damp, but the bold capitalized letters printed across the top were unmistakably clear. It was a final notice of repossession. I read the legal document twice, my eyes scanning the terrifying numbers listed on the page. The notice was from a high-risk automotive leasing company, not a standard bank. Tyler did not own the fancy Mercedes parked in my driveway. He was leasing it at an astronomical rate, and he was 4 months behind on payments. The grace period had completely expired. The vehicle was scheduled to be seized by recovery agents immediately. The late fees alone amounted to thousands of dollars. The realization hit me with the physical force of a runaway freight train. Tyler had not left the car in my driveway to avoid airport parking fees. He had parked it at my house to hide it from the repo men actively hunting for it. He was using my quiet home as a temporary sanctuary for his stolen luxury facade. I stared blindly at the bright pink slip, the vibrant color mocking me under the buzzing garage light. All the fragmented puzzle pieces I had collected forcefully snapped together, creating a picture so utterly ugly I could barely comprehend it. Tyler was undeniably broke. He was a massive fraud wearing expensive suits paid for with credit. He did not actually have driving a car he did not legally own. He had absolutely zero liquid assets. And if Tyler was completely broke, then the $4,000 Brittany had stolen from my wall safe was absolutely not for a luxury mental health vacation to Cabo. People hiding from repo men do not fly first class to Mexico to drink margaritas. They desperately scramble for cash to keep their lives from crashing down around them. That $4,000 was survival cash. It was immediate emergency money. What kind of emergency required my daughter to ruthlessly pawn her dead mother's custom necklace? A repossession notice was bad, but it did not explain the sheer panic I had seen in Tyler's eyes, or the cold speed with which Brittany betrayed her own family. They were running from something much darker. The fake vacation was just a convenient smokescreen. If they were willing to steal from Sarah's memory to survive, there was no limit to what they might do next. I carefully folded the pink repossession notice and slipped it securely into my canvas jacket. I realized the danger threatening my life was far deeper than a simple stolen necklace. I had to find out exactly who they owed money to before they returned. Leaving the garage behind, I walked back into the suffocating silence of my home. The heavy rain against the windows felt like a ticking clock. My mind raced with disturbing questions, each heavier than the last. If Tyler was facing an immediate repossession of his vehicle, every single word they had spoken in my study was a meticulously constructed lie. I needed to trace their current location. I needed to see exactly how deep this deception really went before I confronted them. I walked into the living room and picked up my silver iPad from the glass coffee table. I swiped my finger across the smooth screen to unlock it and opened the Instagram application. Brittany had always been obsessed with projecting a flawless image of extreme wealth to her followers. I knew her patterns perfectly. If she was hiding out from aggressive creditors, she would still try to maintain that perfect facade online. I navigated directly to her profile, scrolling past pictures of expensive dinners. Sure enough, there was a brand new photograph posted just 20 minutes ago. The location tag proudly displayed an exclusive luxury resort in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. The accompanying caption read, "Escaping the severe wedding planning stress with my incredible future husband, enjoying the sun, the sand, and absolutely zero worries." The image showed the two of them smiling brightly, looking completely carefree. They were sitting close together on reclining lounge chairs, holding colorful tropical drinks garnished with fresh fruit and small paper umbrellas. Brittany was wearing a new designer swimsuit, and Tyler was shirtless, sporting a pair of highly reflective silver aviator sunglasses. The background behind them was deliberately blurred out, using a digital portrait effect, showing only vague blue colors that were supposed to represent the ocean and the clear Mexican sky. To the untrained eye, it was a picture-perfect vacation moment. But my 40 years of engineering experience had trained my eyes to look past the obvious focal points and analyze the foundational structures. I stared intensely at the glowing photograph, analyzing the lighting, the angles, and the harsh shadows cast across their faces. Something was fundamentally wrong with the ambient light. The late afternoon sun in Cabo casts a very specific warm golden hue that wraps around everything it touches. The light hitting their faces in this photograph was incredibly harsh, painfully artificial, and distinctly cool-toned. It looked exactly like the aggressive, unforgiving glare of a cheap fluorescent bulb, not the natural warmth of tropical sunlight. My heart began to beat a little faster as a cold suspicion washed over me. I placed my thumb and index finger on the smooth glass screen and slowly moved them apart. I magnified the image, focusing entirely on the highly reflective mirrored surface of Tyler's expensive aviator sunglasses. The curved silver lenses acted like a perfect convex mirror, capturing the entire surrounding environment located directly in front of them, the exact environment they were desperately trying to hide. I zoomed in further, pushing the digital image to its absolute maximum resolution until the pixels began to blur slightly at the edges. My breath hitched painfully in my chest. Staring back at me in the reflection of Tyler's sunglasses was not a pristine Mexican beach. There was no white sand. There were no palm trees swaying in the wind. There was no vast blue ocean stretching out to the horizon. Instead, the reflection clearly showed the crumbling, water-stained brick wall of a decaying building. And directly above that rotting brick wall, glowing with a harsh, flickering, unmistakable red light, was a large neon sign. The sign was written backwards in the reflection, but the distinct, jagged font was incredibly easy to read. It said, "Stardust Motor Inn, hourly rates available." I felt the blood drain completely from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. I knew exactly where the Stardust Motor Inn was located. It was a notoriously cheap, highly dangerous motel situated off a forgotten stretch of the interstate. It was surrounded by abandoned warehouses, rusting chain-link fences, and empty industrial lots. It was barely a 2-hour drive away from my house, hidden deep in one of the most dangerous, crime-ridden areas in northern Illinois. It was the exact kind of desolate place people went when they needed to vanish completely off the grid. It was a dark sanctuary for fugitives, desperate addicts, and terrified people hiding from violent debt collectors. The realization crashed over my entire body with terrifying, absolute clarity. The entire Cabo vacation was an elaborate, desperate, and pathetic fabrication. They were not sipping expensive margaritas on a luxury beach thousands of miles away. They were hiding out in a filthy, hourly motel, surrounded by dangerous criminals, absolutely terrified that the repo men, or whoever else they owed a massive amount of money to, would finally track them down and break down their door. They had purposely staged a fake photograph, using cheap props and digitally blurred backgrounds to convince everyone that they were living a life of extreme luxury and relaxation. The sheer audacity of their lie was staggering. My hands grew remarkably cold, gripping the thin edges of the iPad so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I thought about the $4,000. I thought about my beautiful Sarah's custom jade necklace. If Brittany and Tyler were hiding in a desperate panic at a cheap hourly motel just 2 hours away, then the money she received from the pawn shop was absolutely not used for a luxury resort deposit. It was emergency survival cash. It was dirty money used to buy a little more time to pay off violent people. Brittany had ruthlessly stolen my dead wife's memory simply to survive the immediate terrifying consequences of Tyler's massive hidden financial crimes. I closed the Instagram application, the screen going dark, and set the iPad down on the heavy oak desk in front of me. The violent anger inside me slowly solidified into something entirely different. It was a cold, sharp, mechanical determination that I had not felt since the days I stood on freezing scaffolding, inspecting flawed steel beams. I now knew exactly how desperate they were. I knew they were living in a fragile house of cards that was rapidly collapsing around them. But more importantly, I realized that the jade necklace was the only tangible thread connecting me directly to the actual truth. That single financial transaction was the very first falling domino in this horrifying chain of events. If I truly wanted to understand the full scope of their criminal deception, I absolutely had to get that necklace back immediately. I had to go down to that pawn shop, face the owner, and retrieve the one precious thing they had discarded. I knew, with absolute unwavering certainty, that finding the pawn shop receipt was no longer just about recovering a nostalgic piece of jewelry. It was about obtaining the ultimate weapon against them. I slowly stood up from my desk, my jaw clenched tight, completely ready to search Brittany's messy old room. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the guest bedroom that Brittany had claimed as her own during the wedding planning. My footsteps were completely silent against the carpet. I gripped the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into a space that perfectly mirrored the disorganized state of my daughter's life. The room was an absolute disaster. Expensive clothes were thrown carelessly across the back of an antique wooden chair. Designer shoes were kicked into the corners, and half-empty coffee cups stained the edges of Sarah's mahogany dresser. As a man who had spent his life organizing blueprints, the negligence made my chest tighten. It was a profound display of disrespect for the home I worked hard to provide. I stepped over a scarf and moved toward her dresser, knowing I had limited time before they might realize their mistake and turn back. I opened the top drawer, sifting through tangled jewelry and crumpled receipts. As my hands moved methodically through the clutter, my mind drifted back to the early years of Brittany's childhood. Sarah had been the ultimate protector, possessing a boundless capacity for forgiveness. Whenever Brittany broke a rule, failed a class, or ruined something valuable, Sarah was always there to soften the blow. She would smooth over the sharp edges of my discipline, reminding me that Brittany was just a child, that she needed a gentle hand rather than a lesson in accountability. I had foolishly stepped back, allowing my wife to shield our daughter from the consequences of her actions. I thought I was being a supportive husband, honoring her parenting instincts, while I focused entirely on providing our financial stability. I closed the top drawer and opened the second, finding nothing but more expensive chaos. I realized now with sickening clarity exactly what that constant shielding had produced. By removing every single obstacle from Brittany's path, we had never allowed her to develop a moral compass. We unknowingly raised a woman who genuinely believed the entire world existed solely to cater to her immediate desires. She never faced a single moment of genuine adversity, never felt the sting of real consequences, and never learned the fundamental value of a hard-earned dollar. The tragic result of that endless indulgence was a woman who could stare her grieving father in the eye and casually admit to selling her dead mother's necklace without a single ounce of remorse. The guilt of my own complicity in her upbringing washed over me, but I quickly pushed it aside. Regret was a useless emotion right now. I needed hard evidence. I moved away from the dresser and walked over to the large walk-in closet. The floor was completely covered in a mountain of discarded shoeboxes and high-end shopping bags. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp ache in my knees, and began pulling the boxes apart. Brittany had always been terrible at hiding things. She lacked the basic organizational skills required to maintain a complex deception. If she had a pawnshop receipt, it would not be locked away in a secure file. It would be shoved somewhere carelessly buried under a pile of her own impulsive mistakes. I reached into the back corner of the closet and pulled out a heavy cardboard box that looked completely out of place among the glossy designer labels. The top flaps were loosely folded together. I opened it and found a massive stack of unopened mail bank statements and legal envelopes. I carried the heavy box over to the unmade bed and dumped the contents onto the mattress. I began tearing open the envelopes one by one, my eyes scanning the terrifying numbers printed in bold ink. These were not just standard credit card bills. These were final collection notices, aggressive letters from debt consolidation agencies, and severe warnings of impending legal action. Brittany was carrying tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest consumer debt, completely independent of whatever financial disaster Tyler had dragged them into. She had been bleeding money for years, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of a wealthy socialite, while her actual bank accounts were completely drained. I sorted through the terrifying mountain of paper, my hands moving with the steady rhythm of an engineer dissecting a collapsed bridge. Every single document I opened revealed another hidden structural failure in her life. I reached the bottom of the pile and found a thick stack of recent credit card bills clipped together with a rusted binder clip. The dates on the envelopes were from the past 2 weeks. This was the most recent wave of financial panic. I carefully removed the metal clip and began flipping through the pages. The statements showed a frantic pattern of small, desperate purchases, fast food, discount gas stations, and minimum payments that had ultimately bounced due to insufficient funds. The glamorous lifestyle she projected to the world on social media was an absolute fiction. They were living in a constant state of financial freefall, desperately scrambling to keep the fragile illusion intact for just one more day. I kept turning the pages, my eyes scanning for any handwritten notes or loose scraps of paper that might have been accidentally folded into the stack of debt. Then my fingers brushed against something completely different. Wedged tightly between a threatening letter from a credit card company and a final utility warning, I felt the distinct texture of a slightly thicker, waxy piece of paper. I pulled the 2 pages apart. A crumpled, bright yellow carbon copy receipt fluttered out and landed softly on the bedspread. I reached down and picked it up, my heart hammering a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. I carefully smoothed out the deep creases in the yellow paper, holding it up to the light of the bedside lamp to read the faded ink. It was exactly what I had been searching for. The bold black letters stamped across the top of the receipt read, "Ironclad Pawn and Trading," located right in the heart of downtown Chicago. Below the store name was a detailed description of the item pawned: one vintage gold chain with a heavy green jade pendant. I stared at the $4,000 payout printed at the bottom of the receipt, right next to my daughter's messy, hurried signature. She had signed away her mother's beautiful legacy without a single second thought, trading priceless sentiment for a brief moment of financial relief. The pawn shop had formally documented the transaction just yesterday afternoon. According to the strict printed terms clearly written on the back of the ticket, the shop was legally required to securely hold the item inside a heavy steel vault for 48 hours before putting it out on the retail floor for public sale. I quickly checked my watch. I still had enough time. The necklace was still sitting safely inside their vault, waiting to be rescued from the devastating consequences of my daughter's absolute greed. I did not waste another second looking at the horrifying disaster surrounding me in that room. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my mobile phone, and immediately dialed the 10-digit phone number printed boldly on the top of the yellow receipt. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. Each ring felt like an eternity, dragging out the agonizing seconds while I stood in the middle of my daughter's chaotic bedroom. Through the receiver, I could hear the muffled, chaotic background noises of downtown Chicago. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, accompanied by the distinct sound of a heavy metal security door slamming shut. Finally, a gruff, gravelly voice cut through the static. He answered with a sharp, no-nonsense tone, identifying the store as Ironclad Pawn and Trading and introducing himself as Mike. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to handle this transaction with the same precise, calculated control I used when negotiating massive steel contracts. I could not afford to sound like a frantic, grieving widower, and I certainly could not reveal that my own daughter had stolen the item. If I mentioned theft, he would be legally obligated to involve the police, freeze the asset as criminal evidence, and tie up my wife's necklace in a lengthy legal battle for months. I just needed to buy it back quickly and quietly. I introduced myself, clearly keeping my voice low and authoritative. I told him that a young woman had come into his shop yesterday afternoon and pawned a vintage gold chain featuring a heavy green jade pendant. I read the exact transaction number printed at the top of the yellow carbon copy receipt. I heard the loud clacking of a heavy computer keyboard through the phone as Mike searched his digital inventory system. After a few tense moments, he grunted in confirmation. He verified that he had the ticket pulled up on his screen. He remembered the transaction, clearly noting that the young woman was in a massive hurry and accepted their initial cash offer without a single word of negotiation. I gripped the edge of the wooden dresser, leaning my weight against it. I told him I needed that necklace back immediately. I explained that it was a custom piece belonging to my late wife, that it held profound sentimental value, and that it had been pawned without my direct permission. Mike let out a long, heavy sigh. He sounded tired, like a man who dealt with tragic family disputes every single day of his life. He explained the strict municipal laws regarding pawned goods. He told me that once an item crosses his counter, it is legally bound by a mandatory holding period. He said his hands were completely tied, citing strict store policies and local ordinances designed to prevent the fencing of stolen goods. He insisted that I would have to wait until the holding period expired, at which point the necklace would be placed on the public retail floor, and I could purchase it just like any other customer. I was not going to accept that answer. I refused to let Sarah's necklace sit in a dark, cold steel vault surrounded by discarded items waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I shifted my stance, summoning the commanding, unyielding tone I had perfected over 40 years of managing stubborn construction foremen. I did not raise my voice, but I hardened my words with absolute resolve. I told him I was not asking him to break the law, but I was offering him a highly lucrative business proposition. The receipt showed he paid $4,000 for the jade. I told him I would walk into his shop within the hour and hand him $8,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. A $4,000 net profit for simply walking to his back room and handing me a piece of jewelry before it ever hit the display case. The line went completely dead for a few seconds. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. $4,000 of pure, immediate profit was a massive incentive for a small pawnshop owner. The heavy silence stretched on, filled only by the faint hum of his store's air conditioning unit, transmitting through the phone. Finally, Mike cleared his throat. The gruffness in his voice had softened significantly, replaced by a cautious, calculating interest. He told me to hold the line for a minute. He said he needed to go back into the secure holding vault, physically locate the specific inventory bag, and verify the condition of the piece before he agreed to any off-the-books cash transactions. I heard the loud metallic clatter of the phone receiver being set down on a hard countertop, followed by the fading sound of his heavy footsteps walking away. I stood in the silence of Brittany's bedroom, the walls closing in around me. The rain continued to violently batter the window panes. My mind was racing, replaying the horrifying repossession notice I had found in the garage. Tyler was completely broke. Brittany had betrayed me to save him. The anger was a living, breathing entity inside my chest, but I pushed it down, focusing entirely on the task at hand. I just needed Sarah's necklace back. Once I had it secured in my hands, I could figure out exactly how to dismantle Tyler's pathetic, fraudulent life. Several long minutes passed. The waiting was sheer agony. Then I heard the heavy footsteps approaching the phone again. The receiver was picked up. But when Mike spoke, his entire demeanor had shifted drastically. The gruff, calculating businessman was entirely gone. His voice was remarkably quiet, laced with a strange, hesitant apprehension. He did not sound like a man negotiating a profitable deal. He sounded profoundly disturbed. "Mr. Stanton," Mike said, his voice dropping to a low, trembling whisper. I pulled the inventory bag from the vault. I have the piece sitting right here on the desk in front of me. "Good," I replied, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. "I have the $8,000 ready. I am leaving my house right now. I will be at your shop in less than an hour." "Sir, you need to listen to me," Mike interrupted, his tone urgent and highly irregular. When I took the necklace out of the bag, I was inspecting the gold setting under my jeweler's loupe to verify the purity marks. My thumb brushed against the side of the jade stone. "Sir, you will not believe what we found when we opened the medallion on the pendant." My entire body went completely rigid. My breath caught sharply in my throat, refusing to move. I stared blindly at the wall, my mind violently rejecting the words he had just spoken. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "The medallion, sir," Mike repeated, sounding incredibly unnerved. "There is a microscopic, nearly invisible seam running along the outer edge of the green stone. Someone hollowed out the center and installed a tiny flush magnetic hinge. The jade split perfectly in half when I applied pressure. It is a hidden locket." A deafening, high-pitched ringing erupted in my ears. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was suddenly tilting. That was absolutely impossible. It made zero structural or logical sense. I commissioned that necklace myself 30 years ago from a master jeweler in the Diamond District. I handpicked the raw solid block of deep green jade. I watched the artisan carve it into a heavy solid teardrop shape. It was a single uninterrupted piece of dense stone. It was not a locket. It did not have a hinge. It absolutely did not open. "You are mistaken," I said, gripping the phone so hard the plastic casing creaked under the immense pressure. "That necklace is a solid piece of carved jade. It does not open." "I am looking right at it, Mr. Stanton," Mike insisted, his voice trembling with an unsettling certainty. "It opens. Someone went to incredible, highly expensive lengths to modify this piece without altering its outward appearance. It requires a master level of precision to hollow out a stone like this without shattering it. And sir, the compartment is not empty. There is something hidden inside it." The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. My engineering mind, usually capable of rationalizing any complex problem, was completely short-circuiting. If the necklace opened, it meant someone had deliberately modified it after I purchased it. And the only person who had constant, unrestricted access to that jewelry for the past 30 years was Sarah. My sweet, gentle, loving wife had secretly hired a master jeweler to hollow out her favorite necklace, turning it into a hidden, undetectable vault. But why? What could she possibly need to hide so desperately that she would permanently alter her most prized possession? What kind of terrifying secret was she carrying in the final days of her life? The repossession notice in my jacket pocket suddenly felt like a massive lead weight. Tyler's fake financial empire. Brittany's desperate theft. The sudden, unexplainable modification of a solid jade stone. None of this was a coincidence. They were all connected by a dark, invisible thread, and the absolute truth was waiting for me inside a pawn shop in downtown Chicago. "Mike," I commanded, my voice echoing with a fierce, terrifying urgency. "Do not touch whatever is inside that stone. Do not close it. Do not let anyone else near it. I am leaving this very second. I will be there as fast as humanly possible." "I will hold it in the back office, sir," Mike promised quietly. "Please drive safely." I hung up the phone and shoved it violently into my pocket. I did not bother to turn off the bedside lamp. I did not look back at the chaotic disaster of my daughter's bedroom. I sprinted down the long wooden staircase, my heart hammering a frantic, explosive rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter and burst out the front door, stepping directly into the freezing, torrential rain. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my truck, slamming the heavy door shut, and aggressively twisted the key in the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, matching the ferocious intensity burning deep inside my chest. I threw the gear shift into reverse, my tires spinning wildly against the wet pavement as I sped toward the blinding lights of downtown Chicago. The blinding neon lights of downtown Chicago bled through the heavy rain streaking across my windshield. I navigated the slick, congested city streets with a dangerous, single-minded focus, completely ignoring the angry blares of car horns around me. My heavy truck tires hydroplaned slightly over deep puddles, but my hands kept the steering wheel in a steady, unyielding grip. The towering skyscrapers of the financial district loomed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows onto the wet pavement. My mind was trapped in a chaotic whirlwind of impossible scenarios. Sarah, my gentle and honest wife, had secretly hollowed out her solid jade necklace to create a hidden vault. The absolute absurdity of that fact fought a violent battle against the grim reality I was speeding toward. I took a sharp right turn down a narrow, dimly lit commercial avenue and finally spotted the glowing iron-barred storefront of Ironclad Pawn and Trading. I threw my truck into park right in front of the shop, completely ignoring a faded red fire hydrant and a strict no-parking zone. I killed the engine, pulled up the thick collar of my canvas jacket, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The heavy glass door of the pawn shop chimed with a harsh metallic bell as I pushed my way inside. The interior smelled of old dust-stale tobacco and cheap brass polish. Glass display cases lined the narrow room, filled with forgotten watches, tarnished musical instruments, and rows of heavy power tools. Behind the thick, bulletproof glass of the primary counter stood a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard and sharp, assessing eyes. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and had a jeweler's loop resting casually around his neck on a black cord. I walked directly up to the reinforced glass partition, locking eyes with him. I did not bother with formal introductions or pleasantries. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out the thick banded stacks of crisp $100 bills I had withdrawn from my emergency safe, and pushed exactly $5,000 through the small metal slot at the bottom of the window. I had promised him a massive payout on the phone, but my bank limits and the sheer urgency of the situation meant I brought what I had immediately available. $5,000 was still $1,000 of pure immediate profit over the original pawn value. Mike stared at the heavy stack of currency, his calloused hands resting on the counter. He gave a slow, understanding nod completely, ignoring the discrepancy from my frantic phone offer, and pulled the cash through the slot. Without saying a single word, he reached beneath the counter and placed a small, dark velvet tray onto the glass surface. Resting in the center of the tray was Sarah's vintage gold chain. The deep green jade pendant, the beautiful stone I had personally selected 30 years ago, was resting wide open. I stared at it, my breath catching painfully in my throat. It looked like a biological anomaly, a solid rock sliced cleanly down the middle. Mike leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet shop. He explained that the craftsmanship was absolutely staggering. He pointed a thick finger at the microscopic silver-toned seam running along the very edge of the stone. He told me the jeweler had used a highly specialized laser to cut the jade, installing a tiny, virtually undetectable magnetic hinge that held the two halves together with seamless precision. He explained that this magnetic seal was so incredibly tight, it was completely airtight and waterproof. Unless you knew exactly where to apply pressure with your thumb, the mechanism would never release. It would simply look and feel like a heavy, solid piece of valuable stone. I listened to his technical explanation, feeling a cold, sickening dread spreading through my veins. This was not a cheap novelty locket purchased from a catalog. This was a highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive modification designed to hide something of monumental importance. My trembling fingers reached out and gently touched the open pendant. The center of the jade had been meticulously hollowed out, creating a small, perfectly smooth circular chamber. Resting inside that dark green chamber were two tiny objects. The first was a microscopic black micro SD card, the kind used in high-definition hidden cameras or modern digital recording devices. The second was a tiny piece of thin white paper folded tightly into a perfect square to fit the exact dimensions of the hollowed stone. I carefully pinched the small piece of paper between my thumb and index finger, lifting it out of its hidden vault. I unfolded the paper with extreme caution, terrified that the fragile material might tear. The edges were slightly worn, as if it had been folded and refolded multiple times. I smoothed it out against the glass counter, bringing it closer to the dim overhead lighting. My heart stopped completely. The writing on the paper was tiny, neat, and elegant. I would recognize those looping letters anywhere on Earth. It was unmistakably Sarah's handwriting. The ink was slightly faded, but the message was bold, direct, and utterly terrifying. It read, "Richard, if you find this watch, the house." The air in the pawn shop suddenly felt thin and unbreathable. The words burned into my retinas, echoing in my mind with the volume of a screaming siren. "Richard, if you find this watch, the house." This was not a romantic love letter. This was not a sentimental note kept close to her heart for nostalgic reasons. This was a clear, calculated, and urgent directive. It was a posthumous warning from my dead wife. The entire mystery violently pivoted in that exact second. My focus shifted instantly from the petty, disgusting theft committed by my spoiled daughter to a massive, terrifying unknown. Sarah knew something deeply disturbing before she died. She was terrified enough to alter her favorite piece of jewelry, turning it into a secret vessel to hide digital evidence. She had anticipated a moment where she might not be around to tell me herself. I stared at the tiny black micro SD card still resting inside the green jade chamber. Whatever was stored on that minuscule piece of plastic was the absolute key to everything. It was the exact reason she had left me this desperate breadcrumb trail. It held the visual evidence she wanted me to see. I carefully scooped the tiny memory card out of the pendant, clutching it tightly in the palm of my hand. I snapped the jade stone shut. The magnetic hinge clicked with a solid, satisfying snap, instantly transforming the pendant back into an innocent, solid piece of jewelry. I placed the necklace into my jacket pocket, nodding a silent, grim thank you to Mike. I spun around and practically sprinted out of the pawn shop, throwing the heavy glass door open. The freezing rain lashed against my face, but I did not feel the cold. The adrenaline pumping through my system was entirely consuming. I ran down the flooded sidewalk and yanked open the door of my truck, jumping into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet, dry cabin. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I reached into the back seat and grabbed my heavy silver laptop from my leather work bag. I balanced the computer on my knees, pressing the power button with a frantic urgency. The screen illuminated the dark cabin with a harsh bluish glow. I retrieved the tiny micro SD card from my palm, my fingers fumbling slightly as I retrieved a small metallic adapter from my bag. I slid the tiny black card into the adapter, took a deep, agonizing breath, and firmly plugged it into the side port of my laptop. The computer hummed quietly, preparing to reveal the dark secrets my wife had died hiding. The computer hummed quietly, preparing to reveal the dark secrets my wife had died hiding. A small window popped open on the glowing screen, displaying a single, unassumingly named digital folder. I moved the cursor with my trembling index finger and double-clicked the icon. Inside was a massive archive of meticulously organized digital files. There were hundreds of scanned documents, downloaded bank statements, high-resolution photographs, and a comprehensive 90-page master document titled Final Investigative Report. I opened the master document, and my eyes immediately fell upon the bold letterhead of a highly exclusive private security and investigation firm based out of downtown Chicago. Sarah had hired top-tier professionals to uncover the truth. She had spent her final weeks compiling this evidence, knowing my analytical mind would demand irrefutable proof. I started reading the executive summary, absorbing the devastating facts. The man sleeping under my roof, the man eating at my table and promising to take care of my daughter, was a complete phantom. His name was indeed Tyler, but absolutely everything else about his carefully curated existence was a fabricated lie. He was not a senior vice president at a prominent wealth management firm. He had never even possessed a basic financial license. Tyler was a career con artist, a charismatic predator who specifically targeted vulnerable people. For the past 5 years, he had been operating a highly sophisticated, localized Ponzi scheme in the northern suburbs of Chicago. The private investigator had painstakingly documented his entire operation. Tyler used fake investment portfolios and forged corporate letterheads to lure in unsuspecting investors. He promised them astronomical returns on non-existent real estate developments and phantom tech startups. He took their life savings using the fresh cash from new victims to pay off the older investors, completely pocketing the rest to fund his extravagant, fraudulent lifestyle. But the report revealed that his house of cards had begun to violently collapse nearly 10 months ago. The well of new gullible investors had completely dried up. When the cash flow stopped, the angry demands for returns escalated into massive lawsuits and formal police reports. However, the legal trouble was the least of his worries. Desperate to keep his scheme afloat, Tyler had made a fatal mistake. He had borrowed massive sums of money from underground, unlicensed lenders. He took high-interest, predatory loans from ruthless, dangerous syndicates operating directly in the city. The private investigator had attached multiple copies of incredibly threatening text messages and wire transfer logs. Tyler did not just owe money to standard credit card companies. He owed an excess of $2 million to violent, unforgiving loan sharks, and they were actively hunting him down to collect their payment. The sheer magnitude of the criminal disaster was almost too massive to process. Tyler was a dead man walking, but the most horrifying revelation was still waiting for me in the final pages of the document. For months, I had convinced myself that my daughter was simply a naive, spoiled victim, a foolish young woman blinded by empty promises of extreme luxury. But the private investigator had gained access to their shared messaging applications. I opened a subfolder containing dozens of intercepted text conversations between Brittany and Tyler. My stomach violently turned as I read the exchanges. Brittany was not oblivious. She was not a victim. She was an active, willing, and incredibly calculating accomplice. The messages clearly showed her actively helping Tyler identify new wealthy targets at her country club brunches and social events. She discussed complex strategies for moving stolen cash between offshore accounts. She openly laughed about how easily they were fleecing their marks. The entire luxury lifestyle, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the social media flexing, it was a joint production built entirely on stolen money and destroyed lives. They were equal partners in every single aspect of the massive fraud. The puzzle pieces of the last 48 hours finally locked together, creating a perfectly clear, horrifying picture. The fake Cabo vacation was not just a convenient excuse to get out of my house. It was a desperate attempt to establish a digital alibi while they hid from the violent men looking to break Tyler's legs. The overflowing trash can in my garage was a frantic purge of incriminating evidence before they vanished. The repossession notice for the Mercedes was just the absolute tip of the iceberg. They were backed into a dangerous corner, completely out of options and completely out of time. And then the final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place. I thought about the $4,000 Brittany had accepted from the downtown pawn shop for her mother's solid jade necklace. I remembered the dates and the specific financial logs detailed in the investigator's report. The loan sharks demanded their exorbitant interest payments every single Friday. Today was Friday. The required weekly payment to keep the enforcers from completely destroying Tyler's life was exactly $4,000. My daughter had not stolen my dead wife's most cherished possession to fund a luxury mental health retreat. She had not even stolen it to pay for her own mounting credit card debt. Brittany had ruthlessly pawned the only physical piece of her mother I had left, just to make a weekly extortion payment to a violent criminal syndicate. She traded Sarah's legacy just to keep her criminal fiancé walking for one more week. They were sitting in that filthy motel right now, waiting to hand that stolen cash over to dangerous men. Sarah had known everything. She had read this exact report. She knew her daughter was a criminal accomplice, and she knew the immense danger Tyler was bringing into our lives. She was preparing to expose them, to cut Brittany off completely and protect our family assets, but her heart had failed her before she could pull the trigger. In her final terrifying moments, knowing she was out of time, she had hidden the digital drive inside her custom necklace, leaving me a desperate breadcrumb trail to the truth. She trusted my engineering mind to find the structural flaws in their lies. She trusted me to finish the job she could not. I ejected the tiny memory card from my laptop and placed it securely back into its small adapter. I slipped it securely into my inside jacket pocket, pressing it flat against my chest. The paralyzing grief and confusion that had plagued me for the past 6 long months completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hardened, and absolute resolve. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to make peace with my disrespectful daughter. I was a father who had just been handed a loaded weapon by his dead wife. I turned the heavy, cold steel key in the ignition, the powerful truck engine roaring to life over the deafening sound of the raging storm. I engaged the windshield wipers, watching them clear the heavy rain away. I shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from the dark curb. I knew exactly where that cheap, dirty, rundown motel was located, and I knew exactly what I had to do next to permanently finish this. The soft blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark, cramped cabin of my truck, casting long shadows against the fogged glass. The rain continued its relentless assault on the metal roof, providing a steady drumming soundtrack to the nightmare unfolding before my eyes. I had already uncovered the terrifying truth about Tyler and his localized Ponzi scheme. I had already accepted the sickening reality of my daughter acting as his willing accomplice. But as my thumb brushed against the smooth surface of the trackpad, my eyes caught a second, smaller subfolder, resting at the very bottom of the main directory. It was titled with a string of seemingly random numbers, followed by the word "final." I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the cold, damp air of the truck cabin, and double-clicked the icon. The folder contained a single file. It was a scanned PDF document, heavily encrypted, but preloaded with the necessary viewing permissions by the private investigator. I moved the cursor over the file and opened it. The document loaded slowly, rendering page after page of dense, highly technical legal text. My eyes trained over a lifetime to scrutinize complex municipal contracts and structural blueprints instantly recognized the formatting. It was a standardized real estate financial instrument. But as I read the bold, capitalized header printed across the top of the first page, my entire body went completely numb. The document was a formally drafted, fully completed application for a reverse mortgage. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the absolute impossibility of the words. A reverse mortgage is a financial tool designed for elderly homeowners to borrow against the accumulated equity of their property. I had completely paid off the mortgage on my home in Oak Park over a decade ago. Sarah and I had celebrated the final payment with a quiet dinner, toasting to the absolute security of owning our sanctuary free and clear. It was the house where we had raised our daughter, the house where we had celebrated every milestone, and the house where I planned to live out my remaining years in absolute undisturbed peace. I had absolutely no intention of ever borrowing against it. Yet right there on the glowing screen, my home address was perfectly typed out, accompanied by an aggressive, highly inflated market appraisal. I scrolled down to the second page, my calloused fingers trembling against the keyboard. The document detailed a massive financial transaction. The application was requesting a maximum cash payout option based on the total equity of the property. I read the requested disbursement amount and felt the blood completely drain from my face. The number was exactly $800,000. They were attempting to extract almost $1 million in a single untraceable lump sum. The private investigator had attached a small typed note to the side margin of the document. The note explained that this specific type of high-risk expedited loan did not require standard background checks or lengthy approval periods. It was designed to push cash out the door as quickly as possible, bypassing the usual corporate safeguards. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan struck me with the force of a physical blow. The stolen necklace and the $4,000 pawnshop payout were nothing but temporary bandages. That money was just a minor appeasement, a pathetic weekly bribe thrown to the violent loan sharks to keep them from breaking down the motel door. The actual permanent solution to Tyler's massive $2 million criminal debt was resting right here on my laptop screen. They were planning to steal my home. They were going to liquidate the absolute entirety of my life savings, take the $800,000 and hand it directly to a dangerous criminal syndicate. And when the dust finally settled, I would be left completely homeless, facing immediate eviction and insurmountable legal battles in the twilight of my life. I forced my eyes to scroll down to the final page of the document, dreading what I knew I was about to find. The last page contained the formal declarations, the legal warnings, and the required authorization signatures. The lender had already stamped and approved the preliminary terms. I looked at the bottom right corner of the page, focusing entirely on the primary applicant's signature line. Resting perfectly on the dotted line written in smooth, flowing black ink was my name, Richard Stanton. I magnified the image, bringing the signature into sharp, undeniable focus. I stared at the curves of the letters, analyzing the exact pressure points and the unique slant of the cursive writing. It was a masterpiece of deception. It was not a clumsy, hesitant forgery. It was a perfectly executed, flawless replication of my personal signature. Any bank teller or loan officer on earth would look at that signature and accept it as completely genuine. But I knew exactly who had signed that paper. I remembered sitting at our old kitchen table 30 years ago, watching a young, bright-eyed Brittany practice her cursive writing in a spiral-bound notebook. I remembered how she used to forge my signature on her middle school report cards when she wanted to hide a bad grade from her mother. She had spent a lifetime studying my handwriting, and now she was using that exact skill to orchestrate my ultimate destruction. The timeline of their deception suddenly became terrifyingly clear. The private investigator's notes indicated that the final closing documents for this fraudulent reverse mortgage were scheduled to be processed and finalized by the end of this very week. The fake vacation to Cabo San Lucas, the sudden need to escape the house, the frantic purging of the trash cans in my garage, it was all perfectly timed. They had planned to hide out in that miserable hourly motel, just long enough for the massive $800,000 wire transfer to clear the bank. The second that money hit their fraudulent accounts, they were going to pay off the dangerous loan sharks and completely vanish. They would leave me sitting alone in my quiet study, entirely unaware that the foundation of my life had been legally sold out from underneath me. The profound magnitude of the betrayal threatened to completely suffocate me. My own daughter had sat across from me at the dinner table, smiling and talking about wedding floral arrangements, while actively finalizing the paperwork to destroy my life. She had looked me dead in the eye, wearing the expensive clothes I had purchased for her, fully knowing she was about to leave me with absolutely nothing. Sarah had discovered this monstrous plan. She had found the forged documents and the terrifying communications. The immense, crushing weight of that knowledge, the realization that her only child was a ruthless criminal, willing to destroy her own father, was exactly what had triggered her massive, fatal heart attack. Brittany had not just stolen my money. Her greed had literally killed my beautiful wife. I closed the laptop. The cold resolve inside me solidified into pure, unforgiving steel. I started the heavy engine and drove toward the cheap, dirty motel. I parked my heavy work truck in the flooded lot directly across the street from the Stardust Motor Inn. The flickering red neon sign cast bloody streaks of light across the rain-soaked asphalt. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the row of decaying motel doors. I was prepared to walk across the street and tear the heavy door off its rusted hinges, but a sudden sensation pulled sharply at the back of my mind. The private investigator's master document had referenced a final piece of digital evidence. In my suffocating rage upon discovering the forged reverse mortgage, I had slammed the computer shut before reviewing the directory. My engineering instincts demanded absolute completion. I needed to see every single piece of the structural failure before triggering the demolition. I turned off the truck engine, plunging the cabin into a heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the steady drumming of the rain against the roof. I pulled the silver laptop back onto my knees and lifted the screen. The blue light washed over my face as the operating system woke up. I navigated back to the encrypted digital folder and scrolled past the scanned financial documents, the threatening loan shark messages, and the extensive investigative notes. Resting at the very bottom of the directory, isolated from the rest of the carefully organized files, was a single large video file. The file name was simply a timestamp matching the exact date and approximate time of my beautiful wife's sudden tragic death 6 months ago. My breath hitched painfully in my chest. My fingers trembled violently as I moved the cursor over the small video icon. I double-clicked the file, and the screen instantly transitioned to a grainy wide-angle video feed. I recognized the layout of the room immediately. It was my own living room in Oak Park, captured from a high, slightly distorted vantage point, hidden deep inside the large oak bookshelf. Sarah had secretly purchased and installed a hidden nanny camera on the exact day she died, pointing the lens directly at the antique writing desk, where we kept our sensitive family documents. She knew a confrontation was imminent, and she wanted irrefutable visual proof of everything that was about to transpire. The video had no audio track, rendering the impending nightmare in absolute terrifying silence. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner indicated it was early Tuesday afternoon. The gray, stormy light filtering through the living room windows perfectly matched the weather on the day I lost her. The frame was completely empty for the first 2 minutes. Then the heavy wooden door leading from the hallway swung open. Sarah walked into the frame. She looked incredibly pale, clutching a thick stack of papers tightly against her chest. I recognized the bright pink and yellow warning labels of the forged reverse mortgage documents I had just viewed. She was shaking her head, pacing back and forth across the Persian rug in a state of absolute, undeniable panic. 30 seconds later, Brittany entered the living room. She was wearing her expensive designer workout clothes, holding a plastic bottle of iced coffee, looking entirely inconvenienced by her mother's frantic state. The silent argument escalated with terrifying speed. I watched Sarah aggressively thrust the forged mortgage application toward Brittany, frantically pointing at my copied signature at the bottom of the page. Even without audio, the body language was brutally clear. Sarah was demanding answers. She was demanding the truth about the $800,000 theft, the loan sharks, and the elaborate criminal empire Tyler had built. Brittany did not look ashamed. She did not fall to her knees and beg for her mother's forgiveness. Instead, her posture became remarkably aggressive. She stepped directly into Sarah's personal space, aggressively pointing her manicured finger right into her mother's face. The argument grew incredibly violent. Sarah tried to pull a mobile phone from her pocket, clearly attempting to dial emergency services or call me at the construction site. She was trying to expose the fraud and stop the theft before it ruined our entire family forever. When Brittany saw the phone, her entire demeanor shifted into pure, unrestrained malice. She lunged forward with explosive speed. She grabbed her own mother by the shoulders and delivered a vicious two-handed shove directly to Sarah's chest. The physical force of the violent strike sent Sarah stumbling awkwardly backward. Her feet tangled in the thick fabric of the Persian rug. She lost her balance completely and fell hard against the sharp, solid edge of the heavy glass coffee table. I watched in absolute paralyzed horror as my wife hit the ground. Sarah did not try to stand back up. She immediately curled into a tight, agonizing position on the floor. Her hands flew directly to her chest, clutching the fabric of her blouse with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. Her mouth was open in a silent scream of pure agony. The physical trauma and the sheer, overwhelming emotional terror of her own daughter's violent betrayal had triggered a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. She was experiencing a fatal heart attack right there on the living room floor. I gripped the edges of the laptop so tightly the plastic casing began to crack under the immense pressure. I was screaming inside the silent truck cabin, begging my daughter to help her mother, begging her to pick up the phone and call an ambulance. Every medical professional had told me that Sarah could have easily survived the cardiac event if she had received immediate rapid medical intervention. But Brittany did not call for help. She did not kneel beside her dying mother to offer comfort or apply medical aid. I watched my daughter stand perfectly still, staring down at the woman who had protected her for 32 years. Brittany watched her mother violently struggle to breathe for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, with a cold, terrifying detachment, Brittany calmly bent down and snatched the forged reverse mortgage documents directly out of Sarah's trembling hands. She meticulously gathered every single loose piece of paper, ensuring no evidence of their massive financial crime was left behind on the rug. She did not even flinch as Sarah took her final labored breaths. Brittany simply tucked the stolen documents under her arm, deliberately stepped over her mother's dying body, and walked completely out of the frame. She left her own mother to die alone on the floor, perfectly preserving their timeline to steal my home and pay off Tyler's violent loan sharks. The silent video ended, freezing on the haunting image of my beautiful Sarah lying lifeless on the living room floor. The blue light from the laptop screen cast a cold, hollow glow over my face. The profound, suffocating sorrow that had dominated my existence for 6 miserable months vanished instantly. Every trace of paternal affection, every shred of forgiveness, and every ounce of human mercy evaporated into the cold air of the truck cabin. The emotion that rushed in to fill the void was not a chaotic, blinding fury. It was a cold, calculated, and mechanical rage. I sat in the idling truck across from the Stardust Motor Inn, staring through the wet windshield at the flickering neon sign. A younger, more foolish man would have marched across that dark street, kicked down the cheap wooden door to their room, and unleashed a lifetime of violent fury. I felt the intense physical urge to drag my daughter out into the storm. But the raw emotion that usually drives a man to commit murder had been replaced by the cold, calculating logic of a master structural engineer. A sudden, violent confrontation inside a filthy motel room would only result in complete chaos. It would give them an opportunity to deny, to spin lies, or to escape the crushing weight of legal justice. I did not want a messy, uncontrolled brawl. I wanted a perfectly engineered, absolutely inescapable demolition. I wanted to completely obliterate the foundation of their lives with absolute precision. I slowly shifted the heavy truck into drive and pulled away from the dark curb. The heavy tires splashed through standing water as I turned my back on the lonely motel. I had work to do, and I needed the exact right tools to build my guillotine. The drive back to Oak Park was spent in total, terrifying silence. My mind categorized every single piece of evidence. The forged signatures, the wire fraud, the loan shark payments, and the horrifying video of my wife taking her last breath. By the time I parked next to Tyler's stolen luxury car, I had a comprehensive blueprint for their destruction. I walked into my dark, quiet house, ignoring the lingering scent of Sarah's favorite vanilla candles. I went directly into my study and picked up the telephone. I did not call the local police department. A routine domestic dispute would simply get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. Instead, I dialed the direct cellular number of my longtime corporate attorney, Bradley Lawson. Brad was an aggressive, incredibly connected litigator who had successfully defended my construction firm for decades. I told him to cancel his morning meetings and bring the absolute best federal contacts he had. I told him my daughter was actively involved in a federal wire fraud scheme that resulted in my wife's death. Brad did not ask a single question. He simply told me he was on his way. Within 45 minutes, 2 dark sedans pulled into my driveway. Brad walked through my front door, accompanied by a tall man with a severe expression. Brad introduced him as Agent Thomas Vance, a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who specialized in white-collar crimes and elder abuse. We did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. I led them directly into the formal dining room, the exact room where Brittany and Tyler had sat planning my financial execution. I opened my laptop on the mahogany table and plugged in the tiny memory card I had recovered from the pawn shop. I poured us coffee and began to lay out the structural framework of the criminal conspiracy. I started with the foundation. I showed Agent Vance the private investigator files documenting Tyler's Ponzi scheme, the millions stolen, and the debt owed to underground loan sharks. I watched the federal agent lean forward, recognizing the specific criminal syndicate named in the intercepted text messages. He confirmed the Bureau had been building a RICO case against those exact men for 2 years, but they lacked the financial trail connecting the street enforcers to the corporate targets. Tyler was the exact missing link they desperately needed. Next, I brought up the reverse mortgage application. I watched Brad's face turn completely pale as he examined the flawlessly forged signature at the bottom. He immediately made a priority call to the senior fraud director at the lending institution listed on the document. After a tense 10-minute conversation, Brad hung up the phone with a grim expression. The fraudulent application had been flagged by an automated system just hours ago due to a discrepancy in the routing numbers, freezing the $800,000 wire transfer. The funds were sitting securely in an escrow account pending final human approval on Monday morning. We had caught the financial guillotine mere inches before it severed my neck. Then I closed my eyes and clicked on the final video file. I forced myself to sit perfectly still as the silent, grainy footage played on the glowing screen. I watched Brad and Agent Vance witness the brutal, sickening reality of Sarah's final moments. I heard Brad let out a disgusted gasp as Brittany violently shoved her own mother backward. The absolute silence in the dining room became oppressive as the two men watched my daughter step over my dying wife, collect her forged documents, and walk away without a single ounce of human decency. When the video finally ended, Agent Vance slowly closed his notebook. He looked at me with an expression of profound professional sympathy. He stated that the financial crimes alone would guarantee Tyler a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. But the video fundamentally escalated the situation. He explained that Brittany's actions constituted severe elder abuse, criminal negligence, and involuntary manslaughter. They were not just facing financial ruin. They were looking at decades behind concrete walls. Brad immediately began drafting the necessary injunctions to permanently seize all their remaining assets, cutting off any potential escape routes. Agent Vance offered to dispatch a tactical team to the Stardust Motor Inn immediately. He promised they could kick down the door, slap cold steel handcuffs on their wrists, and drag them out of that filthy motel before the sun even came up. It would be quiet, efficient, and thoroughly professional. I looked down at the dark surface of the dining table and slowly shook my head. I firmly rejected the offer of a quiet arrest. A silent apprehension in the middle of the night, hidden away in the dark shadows of a forgotten highway, was far too merciful. Tyler and Brittany had built their entire miserable existence upon the desperate need for public validation. They fed off the admiration, the jealousy, and the perceived respect of their wealthy peers. They attended exclusive country club brunches, hosted lavish engagement parties, and posted heavily filtered photographs to construct an impenetrable fortress of high society prestige. They were willing to literally step over my dying wife just to maintain that shallow illusion. Therefore, stripping them of their freedom was simply not enough. I needed to strip them of their pride. I told Brad and Agent Vance exactly how I wanted the demolition to proceed. I wanted them to feel completely safe. I wanted them to believe they had successfully escaped the repo men and secured the $800,000. I wanted to wait until their massive, lavish wedding rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. I wanted every single one of their wealthy friends, every country club acquaintance, and every fake socialite they had ever tried to impress to be sitting in the grand ballroom. I wanted to drop the hammer when the lights were the brightest and the audience was the absolute largest. Agent Vance nodded slowly, in absolute agreement. The morning sunlight pierced through the dining room windows, illuminating the exhausted but fiercely determined faces of the men sitting across from me. Brad packed away his thick legal pads, and Agent Vance firmly shook my hand before slipping out the side door to coordinate his tactical teams. The federal agents had secured the necessary warrants, quietly preparing to freeze the fraudulent escrow account before a single dollar could be moved to the vicious loan sharks. I spent the next few hours meticulously returning my study to its normal, disorganized state. I needed the house to look exactly as they had left it. I needed to project the image of a defeated, grieving old man who had spent the weekend wallowing in his own loneliness. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and waited for the vultures to finally return to the roost. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, the unmistakable rumble of Tyler's leased luxury sedan echoed up the long, concrete driveway. I heard the heavy car doors slam shut, followed by the familiar clatter of designer luggage rolling across the brick porch. The front door swung open, and their loud, arrogant voices immediately filled the quiet house. I took a slow, deep breath, burying the image of Sarah dying on the living room floor, beneath layers of hardened psychological armor. I forced my facial muscles to relax into an expression of mild, submissive surprise as I stood up from my stool and walked out to the grand foyer to greet them. They were dragging 2 massive suitcases, putting on a spectacular, thoroughly rehearsed theatrical performance for an audience of 1. They had clearly spent their morning manufacturing the physical proof of their imaginary tropical getaway. Brittany was wearing an oversized designer sweater and dark sunglasses, dramatically complaining about the exhaustion of international travel. Tyler followed closely behind, rubbing his neck and groaning about the miserable turbulence over the Gulf of Mexico. They had both acquired an aggressive, unnatural orange glow. The cheap spray tan was thick and uneven around their wrists and collarbones, a desperate, pathetic attempt to sell the illusion of a sun-drenched Mexican getaway. I knew for a documented fact that they had spent the entire weekend huddled inside a filthy bed-bug-infested motel room less than 8 miles away, terrified that loan sharks were going to kick down their door. Yet they stood in my foyer boldly spinning lies about the pristine beaches of Cabo San Lucas and the terrible service in first class. The utter lack of human conscience was a staggering sight to behold. I leaned against the hallway archway playing my assigned role with absolute terrifying perfection. I gave them a weak apologetic smile, letting my shoulders slump to project an air of deep paternal regret. I told Brittany that I was incredibly relieved they had made it home safely. I told her that the quiet, empty house had given me a tremendous amount of time to reflect on my recent behavior. I carefully lowered my voice, infusing it with a pathetic, trembling sincerity. I apologized for my harsh words before they left. I told them that losing Sarah had made me bitter and completely irrational, and that I had been unfairly projecting my profound grief onto their beautiful relationship. I swallowed my pride, looking Tyler directly in his cold, calculating eyes, and told him that he was exactly the kind of successful, brilliant man my daughter deserved. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and utterly sickening. Brittany pulled down her dark sunglasses, her eyes shining with a victorious, predatory gleam. She exchanged a quick, knowing look with Tyler. They believed they had completely broken me. They believed the naive, grieving old man had finally surrendered, entirely unaware of the massive reverse mortgage closing rapidly in the background. Tyler stepped forward, puffing out his chest and displaying a magnanimous, forgiving smile. His confidence was practically radiating off his body in waves. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, patronizingly, telling me that grief makes people say foolish things and that he harbored no resentment whatsoever. He played the role of the benevolent future son-in-law to perfection, completely oblivious to the fact that federal agents were currently monitoring his every digital movement. I nodded slowly, letting a look of immense relief wash over my face. I told them that words were simply not enough to repair the immense damage I had caused. I wanted to make a grand, undeniable gesture to officially welcome Tyler into our family and celebrate their future together. I told them that I had spent the morning on the phone with the event coordinator at the highly exclusive Oak Park Country Club. I had reserved the entire grand ballroom for tomorrow night. I told them I was hosting a massive, luxurious engagement dinner and that money was absolutely no object. I promised premium champagne, imported seafood, and a live string quartet. I told Tyler that he should invite every single one of his high-net-worth investors and his prominent business partners to celebrate. The mention of his wealthy investors and a lavish high-society venue was the perfect, irresistible bait. I watched the raw, unfiltered greed explode across Tyler's face. His localized Ponzi scheme was starving for fresh capital, and the opportunity to parade his fake success in front of Chicago's elite was exactly what he needed to lure in new wealthy victims. He practically vibrated with excitement, his mind clearly racing with the lucrative possibilities of networking in a room full of country club millionaires. He told me it was a brilliant, incredibly generous idea. He enthusiastically promised to spend the entire evening calling his most exclusive clients, ensuring the ballroom would be packed with the city's top financial players. Brittany threw her arms around my neck, squeezing me tightly, squealing about how perfect everything was going to be. The absolute magnitude of their monumental arrogance was truly staggering to witness. They were completely blinded by their own relentless narcissism and unquenchable greed. This extravagant distraction was the final devastating stroke needed to guarantee their complete cooperation without raising any suspicion. I stood perfectly still, enduring the repulsive, suffocating embrace of the woman who had violently shoved my wife to her death. I patted Brittany gently on the back, staring blankly over her shoulder at the antique writing desk where Sarah had hidden the nanny camera. They were walking blindly, eagerly, and joyfully, directly into a federal trap. They believed they were about to secure an endless supply of fresh cash and social prestige. They had no idea that Agent Vance had already coordinated with the country club management. They had no idea that the waitstaff pouring their expensive champagne would be undercover federal agents, or that the exit doors would be quietly locked from the outside. They were planning their grand societal debut, entirely ignorant of the fact that the entire event was a meticulously engineered stage designed solely for their total, inescapable annihilation. I smiled at Tyler, wishing him luck with his phone calls, and retreated to my study to watch the guillotine slowly rise. The following evening arrived with a chilling, deceptive elegance. The private, diamond-tiered banquet hall of the most exclusive high-end Chicago steakhouse was completely sealed off for our private event. Heavy crimson velvet drapes shielded the massive room from the bustling, rain-slicked city streets outside. The long tables were draped in pristine white linen and decorated with towering, ostentatious centerpieces of imported white orchids. Over 50 guests had arrived, filling the room with a suffocating cloud of expensive designer perfumes and the loud, obnoxious chatter of forced high society mingling. Tyler had spent his entire day furiously working his mobile phone, pulling in every single wealthy contact he could reach to fill the empty seats. His fake investors, clad in custom-tailored suits, eagerly swapped embossed business cards with Brittany's elite socialite circle. They were all completely oblivious to the reality that they were simply fresh prey lured into a meticulously designed trap. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided silently through the crowded floor, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with premium vintage champagne and delicate, overpriced hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the massive stone fireplace at the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the repulsive spectacle unfold. Every single waiter, every bartender, and every valet attendant stationed at the heavy oak doors was a highly trained undercover federal agent placed by Agent Vance. I watched the lead agent, disguised as a senior sommelier, give me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod from across the dimly lit room. The exits were entirely secured. The perimeter was completely locked down. The trap was perfectly sprung. Brittany floated through the crowded room in a stunning floor-length silk gown that I had undoubtedly paid for with my own hard-earned money. She clung tightly to Tyler's arm, flashing her brilliant, perfectly practiced smile to the wealthy guests who fawned over her. They looked like the absolute picture of a successful, deeply in love power couple ready to conquer the world. Tyler was entirely in his element, radiating a toxic, overpowering arrogance that poisoned the air around him. He aggressively shook hands, slapped backs, and loudly boasted about phantom profit margins to a group of older men holding expensive Scotch glasses. He was actively laying the groundwork for his next round of extortion, completely confident that my $800,000 reverse mortgage payout would clear his dangerous underworld debts by Monday morning. I watched them parade around the room, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, mechanical emptiness. The grief over my dead wife had burned away, leaving a hollow cavity filled entirely with the absolute necessity of absolute justice. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of their monumental arrogance hang in the air. The steakhouse staff began to gently herd the guests toward the elegantly decorated tables. The dull roar of conversation lowered into a steady hum as people found their designated seats. Tyler and Brittany proudly took the center table, positioning themselves perfectly as the undisputed monarchs of the room. The trap was now fully populated. Once the guests were seated, the rich, savory aroma of dry, aged steaks and roasted garlic filled the massive banquet hall. Tyler could not resist the glowing spotlight for another second. He stood up from his chair, confidently picking up a silver butter knife. He began clinking it gently against the delicate rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing immediately silenced the entire room. Over 50 pairs of expectant eyes turned directly toward him. Tyler buttoned the front of his tailored suit jacket and projected a warm, sickeningly sweet smile across the captive audience. He welcomed everyone to the engagement dinner, thanking them profusely for taking the time out of their busy schedules to celebrate this momentous occasion. He raised his glass toward Brittany, delivering a nauseatingly rehearsed monologue about how she was his absolute rock, his daily inspiration, and the absolute love of his miserable life. Brittany blushed perfectly, resting her manicured hand delicately over her heart. The socialites cooed in audible admiration. Then Tyler turned his greedy, calculating eyes directly toward me. He raised his glass higher, adopting a tone of deep manufactured reverence. He publicly thanked me for my immense generosity, praising me as a pillar of strength and a true patriarch. He spoke passionately about the unbreakable bonds of family and the profound importance of fierce loyalty. He boldly claimed that our family was built on a foundation of absolute trust, seamlessly transitioning his speech into a thinly veiled sales pitch. Tyler puffed out his chest, shifting his predatory focus to the wealthy investors scattered around the tables. He proudly announced that this beautiful celebration was not just about his upcoming wedding, but also about securing their collective financial future. He loudly proclaimed that his financial firm was on the verge of closing a series of massive real estate acquisitions. He promised unprecedented astronomical returns for anyone lucky enough to partner with him on these new exclusive developments in the downtown commercial district. He spoke with the terrifying conviction of a master manipulator effortlessly weaving absolute lies into an irresistible promise of extreme wealth. The fake investors nodded eagerly, completely captivated by his charismatic poison. He aggressively scanned the mesmerized crowd, mentally calculating exactly how many millions he could directly extract from their personal bank accounts before the night concluded, viewing every guest as a walking target. He finished his speech by declaring that the absolute best was yet to come and that everyone in the room was about to experience unparalleled financial success. He raised his champagne glass for a final triumphant toast, waiting for the massive applause to wash over him. I set my glass of water down on the table with a firm, deliberate motion. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up. The polite, enthusiastic applause from the wealthy guests began to fill the large room, but I cut directly through the escalating noise. I raised my hands and began a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly loud clap. The sharp, echoing sound of my solitary applause disrupted the celebratory atmosphere instantly. The clapping from the audience awkwardly faltered and rapidly died out. The massive ballroom plunged into a heavy, confused silence. I stepped away from my table and began walking down the center aisle, maintaining my slow, deliberate applause with every step. Every eye in the room locked onto me. I walked past the tables of confused socialites and nervous investors, keeping my gaze fixed on Tyler's arrogant face. The sickeningly sweet smile on his lips began to crack, replaced by a tiny, almost invisible flicker of pure panic. He glanced nervously at Brittany, who had suddenly gone completely pale. I reached the front of the room, stopping mere inches away from Tyler. The silence was absolute heavy and entirely suffocating. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. I looked at him, feeling the mechanical rage finally engage its gears. I brought the microphone to my mouth. "Let us talk about those real estate acquisitions, Tyler," I said, my voice echoing like thunder in the dead silent room. The microphone felt cool and heavy in my right hand, a perfect instrument of absolute destruction. Tyler stood frozen beside me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent syllable. The room full of wealthy socialites and fake investors stared at us in absolute confusion, their champagne glasses suspended halfway to their mouths. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of printed documents. I held the stack up high, ensuring the bright overhead chandelier lights caught the crisp white edges of the paper. I did not raise my voice, but I infused every single word with a lethal, penetrating clarity that cut through the stagnant air of the ballroom. I turned my gaze away from Tyler and addressed the captivated audience directly. I informed them that the charismatic man standing beside me was not a senior vice president of any legitimate financial institution. I told them that he possessed absolutely no corporate backing, no active real estate portfolio, and 0 legally recognized financial licenses. A collective gasp rippled through the front tables, but I did not allow them a moment to recover. I explained in agonizing, meticulous detail the exact mechanics of the localized Ponzi scheme Tyler had been operating for the past 5 years in the northern suburbs of Chicago. I described the forged investment portfolios, the phantom tech startups, and the entirely fabricated corporate letterheads he used to drain their bank accounts. I watched the expressions on the faces of the so-called investors shift rapidly from mild confusion to pure, unadulterated horror. I pointed directly at a distinguished-looking man sitting near the front, identifying the exact amount of money Tyler had recently stolen from his retirement fund just to pay off earlier victims. I systematically dismantled the polished facade of his fake wealth management empire, explaining how every single dollar of their hard-earned money had been funneled into his personal, extravagant lifestyle. I told them about the designer clothes, the leased luxury cars, and the incredibly expensive country club memberships they were unknowingly financing. Tyler finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. He lunged awkwardly toward the microphone, his hands trembling violently, sputtering desperate, pathetic denials. He tried to laugh it off, attempting to convince the room that I was simply a grieving, mentally unstable old man suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. He begged his investors to ignore my delusional rambling, promising them that their money was entirely safe and generating massive, unprecedented returns. But the undeniable physical evidence was gripped tightly in my left hand. I slammed the stack of documents down onto the center table, shattering a crystal water goblet and scattering the meticulously compiled private investigator reports across the pristine white linen. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a terrifying, hardened whisper. I told the room that the well of new victims had completely dried up nearly 10 months ago. I revealed the dark, violent underbelly of his operation, exposing the desperate high-interest loans he had secured from dangerous underground syndicates operating out of the city. I announced with brutal precision that Tyler was currently over $2 million in debt to ruthless loan sharks who were actively hunting him down. The color completely drained from the faces of his wealthy targets as they finally realized the extreme danger they had been sitting next to all evening. Brittany was trembling violently in her seat, tears of absolute panic streaming down her pale face. She looked around the room helplessly, watching her carefully curated fake high society image completely disintegrate into ashes. But I was not finished. I turned the full, devastating force of my attention directly onto my own daughter. I exposed the final unforgivable layer of their betrayal. I told the silent, horrified audience about the forged reverse mortgage application. I explained how they had flawlessly copied my personal signature to steal $800,000 in a desperate final attempt to pay off the criminal enforcers and flee the country. I made sure every single person in that room understood that they were perfectly willing to leave me completely homeless to save their own miserable lives. The sheer audacity of the public execution finally broke whatever fragile restraint Tyler had left. His eyes rolled back with a wild, feral fury. His polished veneer shattered entirely, revealing the desperate, cornered animal lurking underneath. He let out a visceral, guttural roar of pure rage and lunged directly across the table toward me. His hands curled into violent fists, aiming straight for my throat. He intended to physically silence the man who had just dismantled his entire fraudulent existence in less than 5 minutes. But Tyler never even managed to cross the space between us. Before his hands could make contact with my jacket, the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the steakhouse violently burst open. The deafening sound of shattering wood and heavy boots hitting the marble floor echoed through the grand ballroom. Brad strode into the room with absolute authority, flanked instantly by 3 heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents wearing dark tactical vests. Right behind the federal team were 2 local homicide detectives dressed in sharp suits, their badges prominently displayed on their belts. The undercover waitstaff, who had been silently positioning themselves around the perimeter of the room, immediately dropped their silver trays and sprang into action. Panic instantly erupted throughout the restaurant. Wealthy guests screamed and scrambled backward, knocking over heavy wooden chairs and shattering expensive china in their desperate haste to escape the sudden chaos. The lead federal agent, who had been posing as the senior sommelier, tackled Tyler from the side with incredible, overwhelming force. Tyler was lifted completely off his feet and slammed brutally face first onto the center dining table. The impact sent plates, silverware, and the towering white orchid centerpiece crashing to the floor in a chaotic shower of glass and water. 2 more agents instantly pinned his arms behind his back, violently twisting his wrists until the cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, definitive snap. Tyler struggled violently against the restraint, screaming obscenities and thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the federal agents. The local homicide detectives immediately moved past the struggling con artist, marching directly toward Brittany. She was hyperventilating, backing away from the table, with her hands raised in the air, pleading hysterically that she had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen money. She begged the officers to listen to her, claiming Tyler had manipulated her into the fraud. But the detectives did not even pause. They grabbed her wrists, pulling her arms firmly behind her back, and secured a second pair of handcuffs. I stood perfectly still, amidst the desperately screaming guests and the shattered remains of the luxury engagement dinner, watching the exact consequences of their greed unfold in real time. The brilliant, intoxicating illusion of their perfect, wealthy life was dead forever. The guillotine had fallen with flawless, absolute precision, severing them entirely from the fake world they had so ruthlessly killed to protect. Brittany collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, the silk of her expensive gown bunching up around her as she let out a piercing, ragged wail. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, grabbing the hem of my trousers, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric with desperate, frantic strength. She looked up at me, her face a streaked mess of ruined makeup, mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks. She begged me to remember the girl I had raised. She screamed that she was still my little girl, my daughter, the child I had protected from every shadow for 32 years. Her voice was a high, hysterical pitch that echoed through the stunned silence of the ballroom, reaching every corner where the wealthy socialites stood watching in paralyzed shock. I did not move. I did not lean down to offer her comfort or a helping hand. I simply stood above her, staring down with absolute frozen indifference. The man I was a week ago might have felt a flicker of sympathy, a dying ember of paternal instinct fighting to keep the old bond alive. But that man had died in the living room of my home 6 months ago. My sorrow had been cauterized by the cold, mechanical reality of the truth. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my tablet, the screen still dark. I tapped the center button, the display glowing bright in the room, and hit play on the final silent video file. I leaned down and placed the tablet directly in front of her on the floor. The grainy footage of Sarah struggling for breath, ignored and abandoned, played out in the harsh light. Brittany went completely still. Her sobbing halted instantly as she stared at the image of her dying mother on the screen. The ballroom remained deathly silent, the air heavy with the weight of the evidence. I leaned closer to her, my voice low, steady, and devoid of any remaining warmth. I whispered that she had stopped being my daughter the very moment she stepped over her mother's dying body to steal those forged papers. I told her that in that singular, horrific instant, she had severed our bloodline forever. She was no longer a child of mine. She was merely a stranger who had committed an unspeakable act of cruelty. I stood up straight, signaling to Agent Vance. The detectives stepped forward, their presence immediate and heavy. Brittany did not fight as the steel cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. She simply slumped forward, her spirit completely broken, and began to scream a name that no longer mattered. They dragged her away, her voice fading as they pulled her through the grand ballroom doors, leaving behind only the echoing sound of her regret. A week later, the silence in my house was profound. It was the heavy, sanctified quiet of a tomb that had finally been unsealed. The legal teams had successfully canceled the fraudulent reverse mortgage, ensuring my home was once again entirely mine, safe from the vultures who had tried to hollow it out. I spent the afternoon in my study, the space where I had pieced together the fragments of the conspiracy. I held Sarah's jade necklace in my open palm, the cool green stone resting against my skin. The secret vault was empty now, the evidence of her final heroic act safely tucked away in the hands of federal prosecutors. I walked over to the mahogany bar, poured a modest measure of bourbon into a crystal glass, and sat in my favorite leather chair. I looked up at the portrait of my wife hanging above the desk. Her smile was calm, gentle, and knowing. The toxic rot that had consumed our lives, the parasitic presence of Tyler, and the calculated betrayal of my own daughter had been surgically removed. The debt of their crimes was being paid in the only currency that mattered: justice. I raised the glass to her picture, the amber liquid catching the soft light of the setting sun. For the first time in an eternity, the heavy stone of grief in my chest felt lighter. I had protected the sanctuary we built, and in the quiet of the evening, I finally found the stillness of peace. Family is supposed to be our safest haven, but sometimes the most toxic betrayals come from those sharing our blood. Richard's story teaches us a harsh but necessary lesson: never let unconditional love blind you to undeniable red flags. When someone's actions consistently contradict their words, believe their actions. Greed can corrupt even the closest bonds, turning loved ones into strangers. True strength isn't about enduring endless disrespect. It's about having the courage to face a devastating truth, set unbreakable boundaries, and protect your own peace. Trust your instincts, stand your ground, and never let anyone devalue your life. If Richard's heartbreaking but triumphant journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping life stories. Have you ever uncovered a painful truth about someone close to you? Let me know in the comments below, along with where you are watching from.